In the early 18th century, St. Augustine stood as Spain's northernmost outpost in Florida, positioned along a narrow barrier peninsula facing the Atlantic, its harbor sheltered by sandbars and tidal inlets that shaped navigation, settlement patterns, and defensive planning. Spanish administrators governed through military authority and church institutions, coordinating with Franciscan missions extending into the interior, where indigenous communities encountered imperial demands, negotiated alliances, and endured disruptions that reconfigured regional demographics during the decades of the 1700s. Founded earlier in the 16th century, the town by 1700 retained a compact urban form, organized around the central plaza, the cathedral, and administrative buildings, with coquina stone fortifications anchoring the shoreline and signaling continued investment in imperial defense. The construction and maintenance of the Castillo de San Marcos reflected strategic priorities and material realities, as locally quarried coquina absorbed artillery impacts, allowing the garrison to withstand assaults that had devastated wooden structures vulnerable to fire and bombardment. Economically, St. Augustine relied less on plantation export and more on imperial subsidy, known as the situado, often supplemented by small-scale agriculture, cattle raising, and trade with nearby colonies, creating a fragile system dependent on distant fiscal decisions. The town's population included Spanish soldiers, settlers, free people of African descent, and indigenous allies, forming a layered community in which legal status, service obligations, and proximity to authority influenced daily life and opportunities within a constrained frontier environment. Geographically, the settlement's position along the Matanzas River estuary connected inland waterways to the Atlantic, enabling movement of supplies and people while also exposing approaches to constant surveillance from watchtowers and patrols guarding the inlet against foreign intrusion. British expansion in the Carolinas pressure on Spanish Florida, as traders and militias extended influence among indigenous nations, intensifying competition for alliances and contributing to cycles of raids, counter-raids, and displacement that destabilized mission communities across the northern frontier. The War of the Spanish Succession reverberated locally through Queen Anne's War, bringing English colonial forces and their allies southward, culminating in the Siege of 1702, when St. Augustine endured attack but the stone fortress prevented complete destruction. After the siege, the town rebuilt and reasserted its defensive posture, with Spanish authorities reinforcing fortifications and reorganizing militia obligations, demonstrating a pattern of resilience shaped by limited resources, external threats, and the necessity of maintaining an imperial presence. Throughout the mid-18th century, mission networks contracted under sustained pressure, leading to the relocation of surviving communities closer to St. Augustine, where local labor, conversion, and protection were negotiated within a colonial framework that altered traditional social structures. Trade with Havana and other Spanish ports provided essential goods, linking the settlement to a broader Atlantic system, yet irregular shipments and bureaucratic delays frequently produced shortages, compelling residents to improvise through local production and informal exchange networks. The presence of free black militia members, of whom fled British colonies, reflected Spanish policies offering refuge and freedom in exchange for service, creating a distinct community whose contributions to defense and labor reshaped local demographics and identities. In 1738, the establishment of Fort Mose north of the city formalized this community, representing the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what would become the United States, integrated into the defensive system protecting St. Augustine's northern approaches. The War of Jenkin's brought renewed conflict, with British forces from Georgia attempting to capture the city in 1740, but again the Castillo de San Marcos held, underscoring the effectiveness of Spanish fortifications and coordinated defensive strategies. Despite military successes, the colony remained economically marginal, with limited capacity for surplus production, reinforcing dependence on imperial support and constraining social mobility, as most residents engaged in subsistence activities rather than participating in expansive commercial enterprises common elsewhere. By mid-century, population fluctuations reflected both conflict and migration, with periods of growth followed by decline, illustrating the precarious nature of frontier settlements subject to imperial rivalries, environmental constraints, and shifting alliances among European and indigenous actors. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked a political transition, transferring Florida from Spain to Britain, leading to the evacuation of Spanish residents and the reorganization of St. Augustine under British administration, which introduced legal frameworks and economic orientations. Under British rule, the city became the capital of East Florida, attracting loyalists and settlers from other colonies, while plantation agriculture expanded in surrounding areas, altering land use patterns and integrating the region into British Atlantic trade networks. This shift produced social consequences, including the displacement of Spanish inhabitants and the introduction of enslaved labor systems a larger scale, embedding new hierarchies and economic practices that diverged from the Spanish colonial model centered on subsidy and defense. British governance encouraged land grants and commercial agriculture, yet the town retained administrative and military functions, serving as a hub for governance, trade coordination, and regional communication within a colony defined by its frontier conditions and strategic significance. As the century approached its close, the history of Spanish resilience and British transformation left structural patterns, including fortified landscapes, diverse populations, and economic dependencies, shaping Augustine's trajectory into periods beyond 1800 while reflecting its 18th-century evolution. Following the 1763 transfer to British control, St. Augustine entered a period of administrative restructuring, as East Florida became a distinct colony, governed from the town, which now functioned as the principal seat of British authority in the region. British officials implemented legal and civic systems modeled on other colonies, introducing courts, land grants, and Protestant institutions, gradually reshaping the civic environment while adapting to the geographic isolation and logistical challenges of maintaining authority on a distant frontier. The town's coastal geography continued to define its importance, with its protected harbor offering one of the few reliable anchorages along Florida's Atlantic coast, making it a strategic maritime waypoint for vessels navigating between the Caribbean and North American colonies. Population growth under British rule included Loyalist refugees, merchants, and planters, many arriving from northern colonies, bringing enslaved laborers and agricultural ambitions that extended beyond the immediate town into surrounding lands suitable for cultivation. Economically, this period marked a shift toward plantation agriculture, including indigo and rice, supported by enslaved labor, though production levels remained inconsistent due to environmental factors, limited infrastructure, and the colony's relatively underdeveloped market connections. Land grant policies encouraged settlement, distributing large tracts to individuals willing to develop agricultural enterprises, which altered land ownership patterns and expanded the colonial footprint beyond the defensive core that had defined earlier Spanish occupation. Urban life in St. Augustine reflected a mixture of British administrative order and lingering Spanish architectural influence, with existing coquina structures repurposed, while new wooden buildings and Anglican institutions gradually modified the town's physical character. Social hierarchies hardened under British governance, with distinctions between free settlers, indentured servants, and enslaved people becoming more pronounced, embedding a plantation-based social structure that contrasted with the earlier Spanish model of military and mission-oriented organization. Trade networks expanded modestly, linking East Florida with other British colonies and Caribbean markets, though transportation limitations and the colony's peripheral status meant that economic growth remained uneven and dependent on external demand and imperial policy. The American Revolutionary War introduced new tensions, as East Florida remained loyal to Britain, becoming a refuge for loyalists fleeing rebellious colonies, which increased population pressure and reinforced the colony's alignment with British military objectives. St. Augustine served as a staging ground for British military operations in the Southern Theater, housing troops and coordinating expeditions, while also accommodating displaced populations whose presence strained local resources and administrative capacity. The influx of loyalists contributed to demographic diversification, yet also intensified social stratification, as wealthier refugees secured land and influence, while poorer arrivals struggled to establish themselves within an already fragile colonial economy. Military fortifications remained central to the town's function, with the existing Spanish-built castillo continuing to serve as a defensive stronghold, illustrating continuity in strategic infrastructure despite shifts in political authority and imperial allegiance. The war years disrupted agricultural production, as insecurity and resource diversion limited plantation output, further exposing the colony's dependence on imperial support and highlighting the vulnerabilities inherent in frontier economies during periods of conflict. Relations with indigenous groups during British rule were shaped by diplomacy and strategic alliances, though these interactions often prioritized military advantage over long-term stability, contributing to ongoing regional uncertainty and shifting power dynamics. As the Revolutionary War concluded, diplomatic negotiations once again altered Florida's status, with the 1783 Treaty of Paris returning the territory to Spanish control, prompting another wave of population movement and administrative transition. British settlers, particularly loyalists, evacuated in large numbers, relocating to other British territories, while Spanish authorities prepared to re-establish governance, marking a second major political transformation within a single generation. The reoccupation by Spain required rebuilding administrative systems and reasserting control over a population that had been reshaped by 2 decades of British policies, economic practices, and demographic changes. Spanish governance resumed with an emphasis on restoring Catholic institutions and military oversight, while also adapting to the realities left by British land use and settlement patterns that could not be entirely reversed. Economically, the return to Spanish rule reinstated reliance on subsidies and limited trade networks, yet the legacy of British agricultural expansion lingered, influencing land distribution and